So, hello everyone, dear Paradigma listeners. So, we are shooting a new episode on a dissertation by my dear friend and colleague, along with his advisor. So, I'm really happy to have them both today. It's an honor to talk about a great work indeed. I had pleasure reading it. So, I'll introduce who am I speaking to today? Professor Björn Egner from TU Darmstadt and my dear friend and colleague, Etnik Dragaj. I would like to welcome both of you. And since the dissertation is in German, we are doing the podcast in English. So for the listeners, they should bear in mind the original work and the original title and the work is in German. So the work titled in English, more or less, a rough translation indeed, The Coalition Sizes in Hessian Independent Cities and Counties. Do rational and institutional factors determine coalition size? So I would like to first begin with my dear friend and colleague Etnik. So your dissertation tackles a massive data set indeed, so covering along like 75 years of independent cities, nearly 50 years of districts. So you mentioned that while national coalitions are well researched, the local level in Hessen was a specific research gap. So what was the specific moment or observation that made you realize, oh, we really need to analyze this as a dissertation? What made you start this journey of dissertation?
Man, thank you very much. I read two articles in the newspapers in the year 2021. At that time, it was discussed whether a coalition will be formed by three parties like Greens, SPD, and the left. In other words, a left coalition of these three parties, or whether a coalition will be formed by the following parties: the Greens, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and Volt. In total, four parties. To sum up, it was the question discussed in the local newspaper of Frankfurt whether a coalition will be formed of three parties or four parties. That was the main argument to analyze the coalition sizes in Hesse.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Etnik. So I would like to turn to Professor Egner. So maybe we can, as the supervisor and the advisor of this great work. So, Professor, how does Etnik Dragaj's like focus on office seeking versus this policy seeking motivates fit into this broader framework, broader academic literature about how political local councils have actually become as emerged in the BA?
First thing to say is thank you also for inviting me. I'm happy to be here because local politics is not a recurring theme of any podcast that I know. So I'm glad to share my opinion here. Yeah, a good question. So maybe I can first give some insights to the academic debate about local politics in Germany or in Europe as a whole. But in Germany, especially, there is a large discussion about the question of the character of local politics, right? Because some people just say, well, I mean, local politics is just politics, just on another level. Like, why shouldn't the usual, let's say, law of politics, why shouldn't they apply on the same way they apply elsewhere, right? And the counter argument would be that local politics is something which is special. I'm not a fan of this argument, but it goes like this, that on the local level, it's not about ideology, it's not about party, it's not about the big questions, war and peace or whatever, but it's just if the street lamp is on the left or the right side of the street, right? And if the kindergarten closes at 3 or 3:30, right? And that's not politics. And this is the argument. I don't share that view. But if you share that view, then the whole discussion about policy seeking and office seeking gets another turn, right? And also the question about coalition formation has a completely other turn because, if you don't care about ideology, you might not care about whether the coalition is unusual. So left and right parties coming together, right? That doesn't make any sense. So in that sense, I found the dissertation and also the idea to investigate this very good, and I'm very happy Mr. Dragaj did this because until now we knew virtually nothing about coalition building on the local level in Germany, especially on this hybrid level, you could call it, where the independent cities and the counties are combined, right? And I have Mr. Dragaj I mean, he's holding better knowledge there than me, but I mean, I can't imagine that there's any publication dealing with this level, is it?
Yes.
Yeah,
No
right,
publications.
right.
So perfect. Maybe we can. Thank you so much, Professor Egner. Then maybe we can continue with like Etnik's work, like especially through the methodology of the dissertation. So you mentioned in the paper, Etnik, so that the data collection was particularly difficult. We also had a chat about it. So you had to contact like city archives, press offices, and in one case even like private individual, I suppose. If correct me if I'm wrong, because official records of the past coalitions did not exist. So it's a really, troubling effort at that point. It's a really hard work. So could you share, maybe for similar researchers working on the topic, how that story unfolded, especially on the methodology? Like, was there a specific district, especially where the history of who actually governed was surprisingly hard to untackle or like unravel at that point?
Thank you for your question. Yes, doing the collection of the data, especially for the counties, as you mentioned, I contacted the archives and the offices of the counties, councils. Yeah, and the special moment was for one county was for the Main-Taunus county, and my advisor had knows someone there, and he contacted him via email. And then the guy, he was the former faction leader of the county council of Main-Taunus, of the SPD, and he delivered us the data for one for the Main-Taunus county, and also my advisor is also knows about the coalitions and at the Odenwald county. Also, it was very hard to find information about the parties governed during the last 50 years.
That was especially challenging. Yeah, Professor Egner, please, if you had additional points.
Yeah, if I may add to this, I mean, this is one of the great things in the dissertations, I guess, that Mr. Dragaj collected data we didn't have before, right? But I mean, let me put that straight. I mean, it's not a big deal if you make a dissertation or write a dissertation about coalition formation on the German state level, for example. Because all the election data is known, we know which parties had the majority, we know who the coalitions were, because you could easily look at the list of ministers and secretaries and then see, it's conservative guys, a liberal guys, so it must be conservative liberal coalition, right? So it's quite simple. But for the local level, there is no public data available. I mean, the counties and the cities are not obliged to record data about coalitions, right? So there is just a coalition, and we could possibly know that by asking a lot of people like Mr. Dragaj did, but we are not for certain that we even get the data. So, I mean, even for some counties, it was just not possible, or for some time frames, right? Because this data is not official data, but you have to get to let's say, create it yourself, right? And this is one of the big challenges, not only just for a wider scope. It's not only the problem of Mr. Dragaj, but the problem of anyone working with local election data. I mean, election data is there, but not everything after that. So coalition building, nothing.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I think that's why this work is particularly important for also listeners who are working on similar subjects, especially on this topic. So I hope this shooting of these podcasts would somehow guide and help other researchers on the field, hopefully, with your like great insights to share.
I contacted the office of the district council of Main-Taunus. I was surprised that they hadn't data about the coalitions of the last 49 years. And also I was surprised that the district-free city, Kassel, in the north of Hesse, couldn't offer me the data about the last coalitions in the last 75 years. I was very surprised.
This is one of the many, interesting findings of the dissertation. So that's why maybe we can turn into building of the hypotheses a bit, maybe. and maybe we can talk about it. So,
Yeah, of
Etnik,
course.
you looked at especially one of your key hypotheses, especially I think H2, the hypothesis, the
Yeah.
second one, looked at the impact of extreme parties. So you found out that the seat share of extreme parties, as they increase, the coalition sizes tend to grow along accordingly. So is this proof that maybe on the local level in Hessen only, established parties are forming oversized coalitions specifically to block parties like the AFD, who has been a stronghold, especially over the last elections, or MPD from influence? So even if it's not mathematically necessary. So maybe we can talk through the findings and the building
Yeah.
hypothesis a bit.
Yeah, of course. Second hypothesis, yeah. Statistically, I improved that the higher the seat share of extremist parties in the district free councils or in county councils, the more party will form a coalition in the end of the day. That's true statistically, but it doesn't mean that number of parties in a coalition rises, that will be in the end of the day oversized coalitions. For we can take an example in Offenbach am Main, for example, in 2016 were indeed 5 parties in the coalition. But this coalition wasn't a surplus coalition. It was only formed because the SPD at the time was very long at office in order to isolate the SPD to take a seat in the opposition. That was on the one hand. But on the other hand, as you said, because in Frankfurt was after World War II was the case, lots of oversized coalitions. Because in Frankfurt, for example, in 1948, was although the SPD had absolute majority in the city council, decided to form a coalition with the CDU. Indeed, it was an oversized coalition because the only opposition party at that time was the Communist Party of Germany. Was, I guess, about also an order by the Americans at the time, because as you know, Germany was divided in different zones.
Perfect. So maybe Professor Egner, would you like to follow up on that point, or maybe we can move on to the other question?
Yeah, I mean, just one comment from my side is that I mean, this part shows how tricky that dissertation actually is, because I mean, one thing is collecting the electoral data and data about coalitions, right? And the second problem is that Mr. Dragaj has to judge which party falls into that blackmailing or extremist or radical category, right? Because that's not easy. I mean, and I like the idea that he did it on a, let's say, on a more general level, so to say, because I mean, if you look at the local level very detailed, you could get the idea that probably you would have to read all the local manifestos of all the local party branches of all the parties where you think they could be extremist and so on, but which is not a good idea, by the way, because I mean, there's no way Mr. Dragaj could somehow get I don't know, the manifest of the Communist Party of Offenbach from 1960 or something like that. I mean, there's simply no way you can get that. I mean, you would need a historian for stepping down deep into the archives for that's simply not possible within the time frame. So, I like his idea, very pragmatic, right? To just say, well, if you are a representative of a radical party on the local level, the variance between the small branches, I mean, they don't really count. I mean, then you have decided for yourself you want to be a member of the party and be present there and run for office, and then you take into account that you are, of course, affiliated with the party, right? Whether or not the local branch is as radical as the whole party, right? But that makes it difficult, right? But I mean, I'm glad for the very pragmatic approach there.
Sounds also as a reader, it's also fascinating, how that developed, especially as a framework and especially overall the methodology. So maybe Professor Egner, we can continue with the with you on the fact maybe especially about the abolition of the 5% threshold in 2001. That looks like it changed the game a bit, leading maybe to higher fragmentation and more parties getting into the councils, I suppose. So maybe looking at the data presented, do you believe maybe the current electoral system makes it difficult to form stable local governments, Or is this some kind of fragmentation or simply a necessary reflection of the voters' will turning into how those councils are being formed?
If I may elaborate a little bit more historically, I think that one have to understand that the elimination of the threshold, as you rightfully mentioned, was a part of a large package of local government reforms in the 90s in the state of Hesse, where we introduced direct elections of mayor, which we didn't have before. So the mayor was elected by the council before. We introduced local referenda actually in the 1990s, which we also didn't have before. And we introduced the new mode of voting. So accumulating votes and mixing votes of different parties, like personalized voting system. And it was abolishing the 5% threshold. So right. So this is just one idea and the idea was to enhance participation, right? To get people out to participate more. And I think they willfully took into account that the fragmentation would rise, although I'm not sure that the state parliament who did this reform was aware of the degree of the fragmentation. So maybe the idea was, yeah, let's have a little bit more participation, and maybe the fragmentation will go up. Maybe we'll have one party more or two, but they certainly did not expect that, like in Darmstadt, Mr. Dragaj, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, in Darmstadt, where like you have 10 or 12 parties in the council, or in Frankfurt, like 13 or 14.
17.
70. Oh, right. So, yeah.
But with the one former member of the council resigned from Linke and went to the
All right.
BSD.
Right. So I mean, and so you have a lot of parties who have just one seat, or maybe two in larger cities like Frankfurt, because it's quite easy. If you have 93 seats, it's quite easy to get at least one, right? So you need something like 1% of the electorate. That's not too much, right? So I guess that the elimination of the 5% threshold was indeed the major thing. But of course, I mean, we have growing diversity among the electorate, I would also say, which leads to growing, let's say, supply side, you could say, if you see politics as a market, right? Voters tend to vote also for small parties. And then those poor parties, of course, form and they offer options for the voters. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Egner. Maybe as a question to Mr. Dragaj, maybe we can continue towards the conclusion. Maybe you found also significant differences between like specific locations in the dissertation. So, for instance, if I mispronounce it, please correct me because my German level is still not really great. So, the Main-Kinzig-Kreis showed distinct coalition patterns, for instance, compared to places like Fulda, which I see it's dominated or it was dominated by the CDU for decades. So why do you think there is like that, maybe the rational choice factors like wanting to acquire office, for instance, worked well to explain that conditions in some districts, but failed to be maybe significant in others like Bergstrasse, which was, I think, particularly one of the interesting findings of the dissertation.
One reason can be the time periods, because the time period from my Kinzig district, I started the timeline. I started from 1977, and from Bergstrasse, I guess it was 1985, because we have, in other words, we have lesser observations. And yeah, that is one reason. And the other reason, what my explanation for that is also the distribution of the variables, the numbers. It can be that one is, for example, I guess in my Kinzig district was a more or less more constant coalition sizes, for example, and for Berkshire more different values. That can one of the reasons could be it. Also my rational institutional factors fail to explain also for Marburg-Biedenkopf district also no significant results.
To jump in, I mean, this is too big for a dissertation, of course, right? So I'm glad Mr. Dragaj took the way we now have, but I mean, if you wanted to go really to the core of the thing after you did all the quantitative stuff Mr. Dragaj did, setting up the models, everything, then you would go into the field and ask, people involved in coalition making why they did that. I mean, in partly you could excuse Mr. Dragaj because even if we would have tried this, he would have ended up with the fact that most of the people are already dead, right? So because he covered such a long time period in his models, then you won't get people from the 60s or 70s now explaining to you why they formed this and that coalition because as you can imagine, people who have responsible positions on this level also, they are in their late 40s or early 50s when they acquire enough power to be negotiators for coalitions. So you can imagine that most of them are already dead. Right. So and this is the next problem we have. So if you would go to the state level with the same, this is a good comparison. I think I mentioned it in a previous answer. If you would go to the state level, you would still find, minutes from party conferences or whatever, wherever this was discussed, or let's say resolutions from a conference or party faction archives and you could talk to people who are responsible for the archive, or there will be a published book about the history of the Social Democratic Party, blah, blah, something like that. But you won't find that for the local level. And this is why I would say most of the theoretical data is lost for us because we can't access people who have personal knowledge of the things we want to research.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges, especially coming from the field of IR, more or less. I would also say the same thing, like collecting data, acquiring that data, especially from individuals or persons from different segments of the society, doing interviews, let alone collecting large data is a difficult tandem to do, but definitely, especially working with people and collecting data from them individually. When you talked about the historical factors it reminded me that also. I think data collection is one of the significant, part of that research and the dilemmas we're dealing with, I think, and the, more or less the limitations perhaps we're dealing with. Maybe we can conclude by, especially with the replication part of the study, like the further research of the study. Maybe I can turn to Mr. Dragaj and maybe we can conclude with Professor Egner afterwards. I think you mentioned the potential, for instance, to replicate the study in other federal states or countries. So, with the next municipal elections also coming up in March 2026, I think it's also interesting to talk about it. And maybe looking at the trends you analyzed overall throughout the dissertation up to 2021, maybe. Do you predict that we will see even larger or more complex coalitions? Obviously, we're speculating, but coming up with the further research part of the dissertation, maybe that is becoming the new normal in Hessian cities, or do you see a different trend in the coming up with the next election?
That's a very good question. I guess it has all to do how parties will anticipate after the election. I guess we will consider the election results and then take the election results into their strategic considerations. I think if parties have one goal, for example, to isolate the AfD, for example, and if votes in the councils, then I guess the numbers of parties being in a coalition at the end of the day will rise. That's one scenario. The other scenario can be that parties don't like to form a coalition with each other. The other option that parties in Hesse have is to govern by changing majorities. But in the end of the day, I guess it depends on the decision of the parties, how they would like to deal with the results they get in March 2026.
All right, thank you so much. Professor Egner, maybe we can conclude with your remarks.
Yeah, I fully agree with the assessment of Mr. Dragaj. I would like to add maybe one or two things. So, one thing, or one determinant for future behavior might also be experience the parties have made. So I guess that if there once has been a so-called unusual majority, right? So with a coalition which you wouldn't expect from the normal conduct of politics, right? So bridging the gap, something, then I guess they are more likely to do it again, right? So Mr. Raga mentioned Frankfurt, where we in the past we had coalition of four partners, so Social Democrats,
Yeah.
Christian Democrats, Liberals, and Green Party, right? Very huge coalitions. And I guess if the AfD succeeds in acquiring more seats, probably this could be a solution to just enhance the coalitions. And if they have done it once, they probably will do it again, right? And changing majorities. I think in principle, Mr. Dragaj is right. The question is whether they would do that because, I mean, this is something we haven't talked about, but Hesse is a quite majority-oriented system, with the city government, Magistrat, where you would need a majority to elect the paid leaders of the council, right? And this is not too easy with changing majorities. So usually you need no, usually what the parties want is that you have a stable majority, which is also taking the let's say the ministerial positions, right? And so I would guess that they would rather go for complicated coalitions instead of changing majorities. This is what I think. But I would say Mr. Dragaj is perfectly right. I think the fragmentations will go on to rise. I can predict where the maximum would be, but because this has to end somewhere, right? I can't say that, but I think for this year's election, I'm quite sure it will rise again.
It's also a super interesting finding that you shared as an insight, both of you, because the upcoming elections and also maybe the other elections, the general elections that will like come afterwards in the next years, that'll also change how the politics in Germany and the local politics in Germany will shape up. So I really thank both of you for your time and this great effort. Really, it's a really interesting work to read. Also coming from international relations, I really missed reading great pieces of work in local politics and such a methodologically succinct work indeed, because we concluded our works with Etnik at the same time, more or less. So it was also a great journey to share with. And I'm also really happy to have you both as this, advisor and the PhD candidate dynamic. I think this is the first time ever happening in our podcast, which I'm really happy, especially for other researchers. I think it will be, promising and also set the stage as an example for other duo dynamics it's a very valuable dynamic indeed, writing a dissertation for almost so many years. So, Mr. Dragaj, Professor Egner, thank you so much for coming to the podcast and sharing your insights about the
Yeah,
project.
thanks for inviting me. Thanks.
Thank you very much.